In this video, I want to discuss the mechanics behind the inclusive hypothetical, which we discussed in the last video, pretty much exclusive. That's what the last video was all about. And I also want to talk about the exclusive hypothetical. All right. The major premise of the hypothetical, the inclusive hypothetical, is just going to be an if then. Let's just put then grass will get wet, or the grass will get wet. So I'm talking about the outside grass, okay. All right, so the if then is the inclusive. The exclusive is almost always going to be only if. Sometimes it will be phrased if and only if. Now so only if it rains, then the grass will get wet. That's the exclusive hypothetical. Now you know that, well, this is not true, right? There are other ways, but let's just work with it. You got to work with the form of it. So I really maybe should have used only if A, then B. But more about that in just a second. I kind of also wanted content in here, so I put rain and grass and all that. But now we don't really talk about it this way. We sometimes say only if it rains will the grass get wet. But that's really, we're working with a colloquial expression of this exclusive hypothetical. Okay, so let's go up here. If it rains, then grass will get wet. Why are we calling it inclusive? Because although we know that this is one cause of this effect, we know that the category of all causes that might bring about this effect includes other things than just rain. For example, what are some other ways grass can get wet? If I water it. If I spill the drink. If we empty the kiddie pool. If we have a balloon fight. Well, a water balloon fight, water, you get the idea. I mean, we could even get really crazy and say, look, okay, so there's a fire in the other state, and there's a big plane overhead drawing water from the Great Lakes, and it flies over us, and all of a sudden the hatch opens by mistake, and there goes our lawn, all covered in water, okay? So maybe that's one way. Yeah, that might be extremely improbable, but it's still possible. So that's another thing we should put up here. So you realize that if I come along and say, hey, it rains. So this is your major premise. And then I give you the minor premise. It rains. You can make a conclusion. The grass got wet. That's what it says. That's modus ponens, right? From the last video. But what if I come along and say, hey, the grass got wet. So you know to yourself, if it rains, the grass is going to go wet. I know that. Okay. And then I get some new information. Hey, the grass actually got wet. At that point, can you flip back and say, it rained. It rained. No, you can't. Because there are these other options. How do you know I wasn't out there watering the garden and actually sprayed the grass also? So that's why if you affirm the consequent, say, yes, the grass did get wet. For an inclusive hypothetical, you can't say anything about a conclusion. You cannot also affirm the antecedent. Oh yeah, the grass got wet. Oh, therefore it rained. You can't say that because you have all these other ones. Okay. Now, in the same vein, if it rains, then the grass gets wet. I cannot then come along and say, hey, guess what? I got some more information. It did not rain. And then you say just, therefore the grass didn't get wet. You can't say that because in saying it did not rain, all I did is I took away one of the causes or conditions under which this happens. I just took away one. How do you know the others didn't happen? That's why when you negate the antecedent for an inclusive hypothetical, you cannot also negate the hypothetical. You just can't do it. The way you would do it is if you affirm the antecedent, say, it did rain. Okay, well then that was one of the causes. It just happened. That's going to cause this effect, so therefore the effect happened. The grass got wet. Or you can take away the effect and say, look, if it rains, the grass will go wet. Guess what? The grass did not get wet. So then I can say, so this didn't happen, this didn't happen, this didn't happen, none of that happened. But in saying none of this happened, I'm also saying this one thing didn't happen, and therefore I can say it did not rain. Okay, so that's how you would work that. That's why the modus ponens and modus ponens and modus tollens work. But what if it's exclusive? Okay, and then there's the only if it rains. What am I basically saying? I'm saying of all the possible ways, you know what? This is the only way. This is the only cause. Well, then watch what happens. I mean, okay, so only if it rains, the grass will get wet. I come along and say, hey, it rains. What can you say? This is modus ponens. So you can say automatically the grass got wet. Okay, so, well, what if I say the grass got wet? I mean, here's, this is modus ponens that works. What if I come along and say, we'll get wet. The grass will not get wet. This is modus tollens. I already know it's a valid rule, so I can automatically just negate the antecedent and say it did not rain. So I can get a conclusion on that. I'm putting check marks in, I'm just saying with these two I can draw a legitimate valid conclusion. Okay? But what if I come along and say it doesn't rain? But since this is the only cause, if I take away that cause, the effect can't happen. So at that point I can say the grass will not get wet. I can now use this to draw a conclusion. Now what if I come along and say the grass got wet? So I affirm the consequent here. Well, there's only one way the grass can get wet. So if it got wet, it rained. I can also use this to draw a conclusion. So, you know, up here, if I negate the antecedent, then I can also negate the if I negate the consequent, I can also negate the antecedent. If I affirm the antecedent, I can affirm the consequent, right? There are fallacies here. If you affirm the consequent in the minor premise, and then in that case you affirm the antecedent, that's called the fallacy of affirming the antecedent. It doesn't work up here. If I try to negate the antecedent, and then from that draw the conclusion that the consequent is negated, then this is called the fallacy of negating the antecedent. That doesn't work up here. Up here, down here, there are no such fallacies because you have only one way it can happen. So you can affirm, negate, basically anything, and draw a conclusion. Now, the last thing I want you to understand is that sometimes you don't have the only in a truly exclusive hypothetical, all right? But it's understood to be exclusive anyway. So there might be some effects out there that can come about only one way, okay? Or by definition of the thing, the cause is hidden in the effect. So, you know, let's just say, if it's not dry, then it's wet. Well, you know, the cause there is really the effect reworded. So sometimes it'll take the look of an exclusive hypothetical, but when you look at what it's actually saying, it's really more of an exclusive hypothetical or a tautology, and we'll talk about those more later. But as far as how we can learn things now, the progression of our way through this logical material, we'll use these simple examples for the inclusive and the exclusive. I just want to try to make you understand that sometimes the exclusive gets worded differently. It doesn't. Sometimes it won't have the qualifier only. But because of its meaning, if you actually look at what it's saying, you realize, oh yeah, this is really an exclusive hypothetical. So anyway, I'm going to close this out now.